Recording. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Fireside Chat. We are going to be talking all about quality of hire, which I'm very, very excited about. I think it's a really big hot topic right now in the world of recruiting and just employee life cycles. I don't think a lot of people have really nailed it though. And so really excited to get a few different unique perspectives here today on quality of hire. While everyone's getting settled in, please feel free to put your name, your LinkedIn profile in the chat, maybe where you're calling from, if you'd like to connect with other people. And for those of you, I don't know, my name is Krista Tan. I'm the co-founder of Talent Collective. And we're putting on this fireside chat today, and very, very honored and blessed to have our three wonderful panelists here today. So we're going to get into some intros for them in just a second. But in the meantime, just quick note, we are recording this. This will be sent out after the fact. I'll also put the LinkedIn profiles of our speakers so you can connect with them after the chat today as well, if you'd like. So I'll be sending out that recording. If you need to, leave early, you'll be able to catch the tail end of it at any time. So today we have Anita, Melinda, and Darren here on our panel, and I'm actually going to pass it over to them to do intros. I think they can introduce themselves a lot better than I can. So why don't we start with Anita, and then we can go to Melinda and then Darren. So feel free to introduce yourselves.
Oh, thank you so much, Krista. It's such a great opportunity to be here. Thank you. My name is Anita Chandrasekhar. So my professional journey started at Deloitte, where I worked as a operations and strategy analyst, and then transitioned over to Goldman Sachs, where I led their interest rate derivative settlements team based out of India. And then I really wanted to work in the field of education for a very long time. So I pursued a master's degree in public policy in Singapore. And then for about a decade after my master's, I was in the nonprofit sector working in various capacities within Teach for America. And it was during this time that I stumbled into recruitment and talent strategy, actually, thanks to Darren. Which I've really, really enjoyed. And then I moved to Zapier, where I currently work about 2.5 years ago, and I continue the same work here. In my current role, I lead the global recruitment operations team at Zapier, and where one part of it, I would say, is more around enablement for the recruitment team, but also includes data reporting, training, knowledge management, and some fun projects like quality of hire. And then that part of my job is also being a chief of staff to my manager. I do not live in Hawaii or Istanbul or Thailand. I live in Minnesota, which is, I want to try and sell as just as exciting, but I will just pass it to Melinda.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm the one who was just in Thailand and Istanbul, guilty as charged. I'm Melinda Kohler. I'm the founder of Conversa. And I also have two lives. I got started in teaching in my very early career and then was recruited into tech and startups. Given my experience as a teacher, I had a very different approach to hiring, a very different approach to performance and what indicated who is going to be a good quality hire. And over the years, building tech companies, I finally got so excited about this. I was like, I have a better way for us to do this. So I developed Conversa to help all of us increase quality of hire and identify awesome candidates, and just really excited to learn from everyone today and share a little bit about my learnings. And Darren, I will pass it to you.
Hey, hi friends. Melinda, I didn't realize you started as a teacher. That is awesome. So my name is Darren. I lead recruitment for Teach for America. We are a national nonprofit that aims to bring some of the most talented early career leaders and college graduates, future leaders of our country, into the education sector to teach in low-income schools and lead change, both within education and without, to try and make our education system more equitable. I started as a teacher. I was in post-Katrina New Orleans, helping to rebuild the education system there. And then moved into talent recruitment afterwards, and just fell in love with this idea that at the end of the day, we all live and die by the incredible people that we bring into our organizations, and creating the conditions to hire phenomenal folks, creating the conditions for them to thrive is more important in my view than anything else. So that shaped my professional career. It's also shaped sort of the study that I've done. So I went to study at leadership at Columbia and then Vanderbilt, and in all of that have really tried to focus my learning on how to create the conditions to attract, retain, and develop talent.
Amazing. Thank you all for those introductions. So funny that you all got started in teaching. This is going to be a fun conversation. So let's set the stage a little bit. Would love to hear from each of you in any order. How do you define quality of hire, and what does that mean either for your organization or your industry or both? And we could probably just go in the same order if that makes it easy.
Sure. Happy to jump in. I'll be super brief here. I think there's two big things around quality of hire. The what is quality of hire, and then why are we interested in it? In terms of the what, I think for at least at Zapier, quality of hire just evaluates a new hire's impact and ability to thrive at the company. And that is essentially what we're looking at. We calculate this with a combination of three big metrics like performance, engagement, and retention within the first year of that new hire being in the company. So that's the what of quality of hire. In terms of why, I think ultimately the North Star for why we care about this is to ensure that we increase the percentage of new hires who have stronger exceptional performance, or report the strong engagement and a sense of belonging within the first 6 months of them being at the company. And also for those who are retained within their first year. And that's the reason why we take those three big things. And as a company, Zapier is focused on talent density, where we really aim for every new hire to raise the bar on performance and culture. And so that is the reason for why we look at this as a key thing. And ultimately, for a talent acquisition team, I think it's around just a great way of learning and continuously improving. It helps us assess our hiring processes and identify early intervention opportunities so that we're continuing to learn and grow.
I love and stand behind everything that Anita just said. So I'll share it from a slightly different angle, which is that if we are the team that is measuring quality of hire, it also means we have a huge opportunity to educate everyone else in the company about how the hiring process plays a role, and also what really does identify a top performing candidate. And of course, for me, this means how can we mitigate bias? How can we think differently about candidates and create a hiring process that is as equal as it is excellent? And I'll kind of dive into that more throughout the discussion, but excited to hear what Darren has to say.
Cool. This is fun. I would underscore some similar themes. So I think about quality of hire in terms of what are the impact that people have in the role, what are they able to accomplish, the retention in the role, because it doesn't help anyone, either the person you're hiring or the organization, if they have an incredible impact, but they bounce immediately. And also what's their cultural experience. And the thing that I would underscore there, maybe building a little bit off of what Melinda said, and I suspect we'll all have a bunch to talk about this, is the interrelationship in those three things, especially when you're aiming to hire diverse teams. So there's a lot of research that would show that the highest performing teams are diverse teams that are full of people with many differences in their life experiences, in their social backgrounds, and how they think and how they see the world. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because when you have a diverse team in terms of lots of difference, you have people with different approaches who are going to see problems differently and come to solutions that more homogenous teams would have missed. But it also introduces a lot of challenges. It's hard to build an environment that feels inclusive and affirming when you have people with all sorts of different expectations and prior experiences and maybe cultural backgrounds or assumptions that they're bringing. It's hard to build a diverse team and hold on to people when diversity sometimes breeds conflict because people see the world so differently. And so in order to capture the upside of creating incredible impact on a diverse team, you need to be really, really attentive to those other two dimensions as well, the inclusion and the environment you're creating and how you retain people. And so I'm always really interested to look at how those three things intersect with one another.
It's quality of hire is such a big topic. There's so many intricacies from even just this short introduction of what you all have said so far. So let's dig in a little bit, and I'd love to start with the topic of bias and how do we reduce bias. So let's talk a little bit about technology. So how do you think technology can be leveraged to remove bias in the hiring process? And what specific tools or practices have you found most effective?
I can kick this one off. So I went out into the world and built a diverse talent community, hidden gems, people who are being rejected, and helped them get hired, retained, and promoted within their first year. And we did it by sort of reverse engineering the hiring process. So looking at a job description and then talking to candidates and saying, well, let's build the best defense for each bullet point. Let's bring out specific results and achievements. And I see a lot of nodding. We know that this is a really good way to help promote ourselves if we're a diverse candidate. So we translated that into a new hiring process. And now there is technology that can speak to candidates as they apply, help them identify strengths that they didn't bring out on their resume, and also help hiring managers change their perspective. But I'll kind of just stop there and say that, the number one way to use technology is to help your diverse candidates shine and stand out, because they might not be putting it on their resume. So stop there to keep it a little short.
Yeah, anything else to add, Darren or Anita?
Go for it, Darren. I think you have a lot to share
No,
about.
no, no, you
We did
first.
that work together at Teach for America. Go for it. Go for it.
I'll say a couple of things here. One is there's some basics or fundamentals that I think are very, very important, which many of us, I am sure, think about and do, and nonetheless, I think I'd be remiss not to underscore them. So having a structured interview process where you are asking the same set of questions to everyone, where you define in advance, as Melinda was saying, what you are looking for, is really, really important to protect against bias. I would say, building off of that, a couple of things that are a little bit harder, require a little bit more thought, but I think are very, very important, are then actually interrogating, well, when I say this is what I'm looking for, why am I looking for this thing? And how confident am I that this is actually a characteristic that's going to lead people to success in the role, rather than a personal preference of mine. Quick anecdote that I would share here. In leading a recruitment team, there was a long period of time where our profile was, we want to hire someone who is great at building relationships, incredibly charismatic, the type of person that everyone wants to pay attention to and befriend. And you could imagine why we would hire people like that. It's kind of natural. But when we actually sat down to study who were our most effective recruiters and who were our least effective recruiters, we found that a lot of those people were folks that candidates talked to and loved. They're I am so happy I got to know this person. They are so impressive. They're incredible. I'm not going to follow the opportunity they were recruiting me for, but wow, that person was amazing. And what I realized was part of it is we were selecting for these people who are so charismatic, but kind of were one track. They were going in here's how I'm going to recruit people, and I'm going to deliver the pitch that's so compelling, but they weren't constantly metacogniting and tailoring their actions to an assessment of what is this person's motivations, what are this person's barriers, what's the thing that I need to say right now that would build upon the motivations or help surmount the barriers. When we started doing that, we realized, well, actually, some of the people who were the strongest on our team were kind of soft-spoken. Some of them were charismatic, but some of them were pretty flat in their affect. You could imagine someone being that person would never be a good recruiter. But they were incredibly, incredibly strategic in everything they said and everything they did with the candidate. And when we realized that, we bent our hiring process around hiring for that characteristic in particular, the ability to apply strategic thinking simultaneous to being in a conversation and present with someone, not only did our recruiters get better, but our team got more diverse because there were all sorts of people who weren't showing up as the life of the party who we had been missing out on and not hiring prior, who came from all sorts of different backgrounds, had all sorts of different personalities.
A good one.
Yeah. On a very similar vein that Darren is talking about, and that we went a little more into a qualitative study of understanding like what causes people to be negative outliers in your data. And one of the things that we saw is sometimes hiring managers do focus a lot more on experience. And I think that experience is another thing that you can over dial into. But instead, if you train hiring managers to prioritize instead on competencies and potential, or just look at skills and that growth potential over specific past experiences and qualifications, which in itself oftentimes are rooted in just opportunities that were available to people, right? So there's an inequity right there underlying. And so if you continue to perpetuate that inequity of looking into just that experience and like where they went to college or where they worked and whatnot, it is the thing that can continue to perpetuate that over dialing on experience. And we often found that when that happened, it tended to like cover out some of the lack of soft skills that people actually have. And we saw more retention issues of folks that were hired because the over focus was on like either just technical skills or experience, because other things were not looked at. So I think going in with the same vein that Darren spoke about, I think focusing on that feels critical. And then the one additional piece that I remember at Teach for America that we looked at in terms of diversity was in terms of just something as simple as having a more diverse hiring panel, to just have folks with more diverse experiences and diverse backgrounds coming in, have different perspectives and can view the exact same candidate in different ways. And I think ensuring that that happens just allows for a more equitable hire, which can then lead to stronger quality of hire.
You all make really, really good points. And I think as talent acquisition professionals or people that are in recruiting or maybe HR, you know, these topics are obviously very top of mind, and we try to structure a process based around a lot of these concepts and really try to create a process that removes bias. But we have other stakeholders in the recruiting process and in the hiring process. And so one of those stakeholders are hiring managers, right? So how do you educate hiring managers to think differently about candidates? Because they might have very strong opinions or points of views. And, you know, what steps are you taking to even check your own biases at the door?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. We had a product design leader using Conversa move 2 candidates to his final round of interviews. One had 7 years of design experience, and one was a recent graduate with less than a year of product design experience. Now, would this product design leader have looked at all of the resumes and selected this candidate? Well, he would not have. He admitted himself that he would not have. But how did we educate him to think differently? I mentioned that with Conversa, you can ask questions. And by simply having a conversation with hiring managers during the candidate intake that highlights this, we created a new way of thinking. So when people start hiring with Conversa, we say something like, well, hey, what question would you ask every candidate? And what would a good answer look like? This helps them rethink their qualifications. But also in this specific case, this hiring manager asked an amazing question that I've kept with me ever since. It was, what product design principles do you value that others might disagree with? And 300 some odd candidates chatted with Conversa, answered this question. And Naishi Shah, this graduate with less than a year of experience, stood out. He reviewed the portfolio and said, wow, this is, yeah, standout candidate. And so many candidates with 5-10 years of experience were rejected in favor of her. Well, Sarah, she did not actually get hired. She made it to the final two, but it's about rethinking those qualifications up front so we can identify the candidates who can make a difference, not just candidates who look good on paper.
So I think about, like, if we're talking about the hiring managers, the stakeholder who really needs to be bought into this, there's sort of 3 dimensions here. You've got to win their hearts, you got to win their minds, and you've got to help them develop the skills. So, building off of what I was saying previously, if part of what we're doing is trying to research what actually leads to the most effective hires, then, okay, I want to share that research with people. I want to talk to them about it. I also want to share academic research with people. There's such a wealth of academic research about how to approach hiring. So I want people to cognitively understand and be on the same page as me, and for there to be no informational asymmetry between us. Okay, so that's mind check. There's the heart piece, and people also need to believe it. So part of its core values and hiring folks who have sort of some of the mindsets that we think are most important, but I'm going to assume that there's, not endemic core values problems among most of our hiring managers, and more go to, like, people need to have experiences that move them. And so part of what I try and do with new hiring managers is actually spend time in the hiring process with them, co-interviewing and unpacking. Here's what this is making me think. What is it making you think? Let's talk about it together. I might push someone, hey, I know that you are reluctant to interview this person. According to everything I know about the role and about them, I think they'd be a really good person to interview. So I'm going to nudge you. I'm like, we are going to interview this person. We're going to do it together, and we're going to make meaning of that afterwards. What I'm trying to do is create emotional experiences for people that show them that things could be a little bit different. And then there's just the skill piece, which Linda also talked about. Like, people just actually need to learn how to be good at hiring, how to uncover the right evidence, how to piece together the evidence. And I think some of that comes out in co-interviewing with people and processing with them. Some of it comes out in debriefing the interview. But the mindset that I always try and take with folks is, like, no one's ever going to be perfect. So this is not about finding someone who has 100% of the things you're looking for and 0% of the things that you're not looking for, or else you will just, like, literally never hire someone. It's a question of mapping out for a unique individual, what is their constellation of strengths and areas for growth? And do you believe that the strengths are going to compensate for the areas for growth? And do you believe that the areas for growth are in things that we are good at coaching and building up, to the point that Anita made earlier? And if the answers to those things are yes, and the strengths are high, then there's and aligned to what we need in the role, then there's a strong argument for hiring this person. But, like, that's just a lot of strategic thinking that I think is required to make a good hire, and it only comes with practice and feedback.
Yeah, and I think just a little bit to add to that is that practice and feedback with open communication, creating that culture of that open communication and feedback, I think makes the big difference. If a recruiter feels empowered enough to push back on a hiring manager, and that is something that only happens with time, when the recruiter feels empowered to push back on a hiring manager for, let's say we have someone who's been hired, the recruiter thought the person was great. They looked through the notes, they looked through the scorecards, everything looks good. But there's this one hiring manager who is saying no, despite all of these things looking right, to stop and not just take that at face value, but go back and ask the hiring manager what it is. And if that means initially you take your manager with you so that you feel a little more confident in questioning those pieces, I think it's okay to do that. And we've had 1 or 2 of those cases in the last 1 year here, where the person has gone back and pushed and asked the questions of, I see certain, and things like certain language or certain words used to describe why they think a person should not come is easy to pull up those biases, but also to not make the person feel defensive, but help them learn in the process that this could be a function of bias, or could be something that they're not looking into, and ask the same questions that Darren is talking about. Like, do you see potential in XYZ while you're seeing this as a roadblock? I think makes that difference. and providing the data continuously to keep showing how we've had other folks in these cases where something has turned out differently, and to put out either anecdotes or data that just shows in a way, as Darren spoke, to like win those hearts and minds of people, because unless they feel bought into it, they're not going to actually do the work that needs.
Yes. Oh my gosh, all such good points. So when you look back, maybe, previous hires that you've made in your organizations, how do you assess whether or not you have brought in the right people? And are there any maybe lessons learned that you can refer to, both on like a successful hire and or an unsuccessful hire, that have really taught you, something and how to move forward?
And jump into the super technical aspect of how we go about it, just to answer the hire, like how do we calculate that quality of hire? What are we doing in terms of the data? And then what we go next. And I think a couple of folks had questions about it in the chat as well, and hopefully it answers some of that. So in terms of just how we evaluate the effectiveness of our hiring decisions from a more aggregate level is that quality of hire calculation. But we do this in two ways. We calculate a score at the pre-hire stage, which is when we're making an offer for a person. We give them a baseline score. We recognize that the score is only so much because you've spoken to the person X number of times and there's a score based off of that. It is not complete, but it is a baseline score. And we use two inputs to calculate that. One is the reference score. So we collect reference checks on folks. There is a score of a 1 to 100 that they get on it, and that's part of the input that goes in there. And then the second piece is the compa ratio, which is, in our opinion, our best proxy for a projected business impact that the person might bring in, is how we assign that compa ratio. So if we look at that, we say, okay, at a pre-hire, we assess that this person is a score X. And now let's see from there where they're going to perform, because this is just a pre-hire base. For the post-hire, we do, again, three pieces, which is the performance, engagement, and retention. From the performance side of things, we're looking at a couple of different inputs. One, we calculate this at the end of 1 year of a person's stay. So the score is given at the end of 1 year of a new hire employee. For performance, we look at manager surveys that are sent out to the new hires manager at 30, 90, and 180 days, just to assess, was there alignment? Is the person ramping up right? Are they getting to where they are? Just to get those pulse checks at that 30, 90, 180 day. And then we have two reviews, performance reviews, during the course of the year at 6 months and at 1 year. It's not technically at 6 months, it depends on when the person joins, but we have a biannual review system. And so you get a performance rating at the first half of the year and then the second half of the year. So that goes into calculating performance. For engagement, we collect the same 30, 90, 180 day scores that we send to the manager, but we ask the employee how they think, so that we understand the alignment. Is the manager and the employee aligned with where they think they should be? And oftentimes you see those one-off cases where the employee thinks that they're really killing it, but the manager is not seeing it. And I think those are the cases where you start to dig into, like, where is that misalignment? How is this being caused? So that's our engagement. And retention is just a score we assign based on, are you here? Are you not here? And then our leadership puts them as like voluntary versus involuntary. And accordingly, we have a formula that calculates the score. But at a quantitative level, that's how you calculate what our quality of hire score is. But given how recent we've started to look at this, there's only so much the data can say, and you can't really take these sweeping judgments based on just the quantitative data. So diving into the qualitative piece of looking at like outliers, I wonder why this person landed here, because we looked at this and we thought at pre-hire they would be a really stellar performer, but we're noticing that this is where they're falling. What does that mean? And then talking to the hiring manager, talking to the recruiter, diving into scorecards to see, is this something we could have predicted? I don't know. Maybe we could have. And then also speaking to business partners to see if they have a better understanding of nuances of where this might be. So there's the quantitative and the qualitative piece that we look at. But I think we're still very new in all of this, and there's so much to learn and grow.
Anita gave a really robust answer, and a lot of what we do is similar. So I'm not going to repeat all of those things, but I want to maybe build off of a little bit of what you were saying at the end around looking at outliers and learning from them, both because I think it's incredibly important and because, I recognize in a very large organization, we have the ability to build these quantitative models that we use to predict whether someone's going to be a good hire and then assess later whether that prediction was accurate. And like, that can sound wonderful, but if you are leading a smaller organization, you have to be like, cool, good for you, Darren. Like, I do not have a team of data scientists at my disposal. That's not helpful. So I want to zero in on the bright spot thing, both because I think it's impactful and because I think it can really be replicated regardless of organizational size. Like, one of the most significant shifts in my own thinking as a leader was from naturally gravitating towards when did we make bad hires and like trying to figure out how do I stop us from doing that in the future, to when did we make exceptional hires and understanding how we do more of that. And I think that was really important for me. One, because it's just like uplifting and fun. It is enjoyable to dive into the positive outliers and think about how we create the conditions. It is really depressing to spend all of your time looking at the bad hires and beating yourself up, but also because it's a lot clearer. Like, when things go wrong, I at least sometimes feel like, God, I don't quite know why it's wrong. I don't quite know how to fix that, but I guess I could try all these things. And it feels like throwing spaghetti at the wall. And I'm like, not super confident that any one of them will actually fix the challenge. Whereas when things go right, in my experience, it is very clear why it went right. And so when I try and replicate those conditions, it gives me a lot more confidence that I'm actually going to do that and it's going to move the needle. So the way I think about it is like, you're going to have a bell-shaped distribution for hiring always. The goal is simply to narrow the bell curve and move the center of that bell curve to the right over time. So over time, you have less variation and you have stronger hires. And the way to do that is to really study who are the people that are having the greatest impact, the best experience, who are really, really successful. Asking the question, why are those things true? What are the conditions in place that enable them to be successful? And then how do I replicate more of those conditions for other people, for the hiring managers, for the people running onboarding, for the recruiters, so that that becomes closer and closer to the norm over time. And that's something you can do in a big organization, something you can do in a small organization. It is fun to do. And in my experience, it has a lot of impact.
I agree so much with all of this. How do we get quantitative? How do we get qualitative? How do we learn from what's worked? And the only thing that I will add is the rest of the organization, which we kind of hinted at a little bit. What is the culture? What are the conditions? And then how are we educating our managers? Once the hire is made, there is so much that is out of our hands. I worked with an excellent manager who came and said, like, look, we finally hired this female engineer. She's not performing well. A lot of people are giving feedback and I don't want to push her out. I want to do another chance. And he ran a strategy by me. He said, I want to ask her about the conditions at her last company. And I also want to specifically get into some of the things that, our best engineers do here, like peer coding, more peer review, more one-on-ones with seniors. And within 3 months, turned around the performance. And now, how can we create a program where all of our managers are thinking about this, educating new hires on their performance, how to manage it, and just giving them the tools to be successful is, well, it's a very difficult question, but I think the first thing that we can do is to just all be aware of it, that quality of hire, there's so much we can do on that as the hiring team. And then following through with the organization to find out, hey, where are the other pieces of culture that we can improve?
Mm-hmm. There's a question in the chat that I'd love to chime in here that digs a little bit deeper. This is from Esra. So when you realize that you have made a wrong hire, what's next? So if this was figured out during the probation period, do we inform them and start working on the pipeline in parallel, or is it too early to tell since this is the training period? So any thoughts on that?
So many thoughts, but as soon as you have to take action. And it doesn't mean that you have to immediately take negative action, but who is making the decision? Is it the manager on the team? Is it someone else that decided this person isn't performing? It's probably the manager on the team. And so then it's who's having a conversation with this manager about what they're seeing, and who's having a conversation with this new employee about what's happening, right? But have the conversations immediately and make sure that that is part of your culture. There, you can't wait. You don't want to build up the case. You don't want to just see if performance will turn around. Performance will turn around if you take action. And I always say positive reinforcement first. Here's what we see. Here's where we want you to be, and let's work together on a plan for you to get there. So I'll just start with that immediate action.
You went off mute before me. You go, Anita.
Sure. I mean, I agree with what Melinda says. I think the immediate thing that comes to mind is, I know, how do we define what that wrong candidate is? Well, who says that the candidate is wrong? How are we deciding that it is the wrong thing? Is there a misalignment with how the hiring manager and the candidate are talking? Is it an issue with maybe not providing sufficient onboarding? I think a lot of times it's very easy to jump into the candidate being potentially incorrect or wrong, but the question is, were they set up for success? Is the first question that I would ask. Were they given everything that they needed to be able to perform at the expectation that was there? And if the answer to all of that is yes, 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 this was just truly it was the wrong decision because we overdialed on something else and now we're realizing this, or it was a culture flag and there's like a serious values issue. In any of those cases, I think absolutely. I think you decide, you always give the person an opportunity to improve, unless it was something incredibly egregious. And if that means giving them that little more support that could possibly push them over the edge, different people learn at different paces and in different ways, to be able to give them that opportunity and let them very clearly know that they are being observed at this point, so that the expectation is also there, and give them that chance to come out of that. And if they do, then that's fantastic, which means that all of your systems in place to provide that have worked. But if not, then taking action, because it is a disservice for the candidate and for the company if they're not the right fit and it isn't working. Because so far in my life, I will say I have been mostly lucky enough to be in roles where I've been given the time to ramp up, but there have been the one-off cases where I felt like this role just doesn't feel like it's clicking. Like I do not know what to do to perform right. And that is not fun for the candidate, nor is it fun for the hiring manager. It is incredibly frustrating for both. And so I think it is a disservice to both to keep that going.
Yeah. Everything that Melinda and Anita said strongly resonates with me. Like, get into action quickly, but also really interrogate where is the gap, and don't just assume that it is on the part of the person you hired. It could be in the systems that surround them. It could be in the other people and how they're supporting them. The only other thing that I would layer in is open conversations, I think, are so important here. One of the things that I worry about the most is when someone is struggling and their manager knows they're struggling and other people around them know they're struggling, but they themselves do not realize they're struggling, or they don't realize they're struggling to the same depth as other people. I think that is tremendously unfair to candidates when it happens. It sets up for huge culture shocks if you do end up moving towards an improvement plan or something like that. And the response is like, where's this coming from? This is out of the blue. And that is terrible for them, but it's terrible for everyone else too, because they quite naturally go to other people on their team and say, I was put on a PIP for no reason. I was put on a PIP and I thought everything was fine. And it starts to erode the psychological safety and the security of all these people who are performing fine on the team around them. And it's particularly on my mind, again, with the idea of hiring for diverse teams, hiring for people from all sorts of different backgrounds with all sorts of different cultural expectations. If you are not very careful, what that means is there will be a set of rules for how your organization operates, which some people will be able to intuit because they are from the same background as the people who set the rules, or they've grown up in other organizations that had a similar set of rules. And other people, through no fault of their own, will not be able to intuit those rules. And so you need to take the implicit and make it explicit. You need to name, this is what we expect, here's why we expect it. You need to talk to the person about here's where I see you falling short, but also I want to come in with inquiry, not just advocacy. Can you tell me how you're experiencing things? What feels clear, what feels not clear? Where do you agree with me? Where do you disagree with me? And like, I think all of this only works when there's informational symmetry, and can very, very quickly become toxic, and can also very quickly lead to just making the wrong decisions when there's informational asymmetry.
I remember as an early manager, I made a lot of mistakes in giving feedback, right? Like I thought I was giving very clear feedback and that the person was understanding that they needed to make improvements. And then there were some big surprises when, we had to either put someone on a plan and whatnot. So I developed a couple of like key phrases for myself that I would use in performance conversations with my employees, like, using phrases like there's some major red flags that we're seeing or major concerns, or, so really making sure the language is like a little bit stronger and clearer that, things aren't, it's not just some little tweaks we need to see, but like some major improvements need to be made. So whatever works for, a manager's style, I think finding some of those phrases that would work for you and the organization that you're into. So there's a question by Nina, and Nina, I'm not sure if I completely understand, but it's going a little bit deeper into the qualitative data. So how do you use this qualitative data in an analytical analysis? I notice a disconnect from a data perspective that a lot of these ascents are written text-based because the added color is needed. Nina, I don't know if you're able to come off of mute, but did you want to add any
I
context?
also realized I totally typoed the crap out of that.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Hello. And thanks for reading my question, Krista. Okay, I'm like, what's actually kind of interesting, Anita, when you were bringing up, the different assessments that you do from a manager POV and then also an employee POV at like the 30, 90, 180 day kind of mark, right? And we think about like talent density and quality of hire, within this kind of conversation. What I've noticed at my organization, and this is something that I've been trying to work on pretty actively with our HR business partners in and around, how can we actually use these like feedback loops a lot more effectively, from like the talent team perspective as we go out and start hunting for talent in the marketplace, whether it's a particular company that we may be sourcing from or looking for a particular background or a skill set or whatever that is. And so where we notice the biggest issue has been for us in distilling this information is that a lot of it is just written text. It's living in lattice, and it's not really connecting very well to our analytics platform, Equitable. And so I'm like, how do you kind of take that qualitative and put it into some sort of like quantitative analysis? Because clearly you can't make a graph with P's and Q's. And that's just been, I think that's just been like the most difficult side because, we think of it as like a, does not at all meet expectations to exceeds expectations, 0 to 5. Sometimes that's just not enough color. So I don't know, how did you go about maybe transforming that particular process to really make it qualitatively driven, to lean into these conversations more strategically? Is my question.
And just to make sure I'm understanding it right, and I think Melinda had something to share. So Melinda, you should go first on it. But Nina, do you mean looking at this qualitative information? You mentioned like when you go to look out, are you talking about at the sourcing stage when you're trying to find people before they join, or once they join and you're looking at performance in the role? Could you clarify that?
From like within, like once they've been hired, they're in the role and we're kind of doing that assessment of like, did we make like the proper hire? Yep.
Yeah. I don't think there's a perfect answer to this or a perfect science to this by any means. I do think that it just requires time and a qualitative deep dive. I think is probably one of the only ways to do some of this, because even if the data tells a number and like says something, oftentimes there are like those outliers that can skew the data a certain way. So you can rely on the quantitative data. You absolutely should look, but the quantitative data will then tell you where to dive in more. So, for
Right.
example, like I think there are two pieces that impact a new hire and shapes their ability to thrive in their first year, right? I think it's a hiring piece and then the onboarding. So I think if you think about the feedback loop, at least for us, what do we want to learn? We want to learn, was there anything in that hiring process that we can flag where we can intervene faster and do something different? Or is there something in the onboarding process that could have been provided that can provide more support? So if you see that all of that is done, but yet at that point where a person's performance is being flagged, either at your 30, 90, 180 day survey, something is coming up where there's a misalignment or their rating is showing that they're a lower rated in their performance or whatnot, then what we did at least was we dove into some of our themes that we picked out as what is it causing. So for example, if you're talking about a positive outlier, you're looking at who are the new hires that were rated exceptional or that were promoted in less than 18 months? Maybe that's the piece that we take out, right? And in our data, that made sense. Now, in the data that you look at, something else might stand out as the outlier. And then in that, we try to find and go and speak to people and understand more, and also went into their interview scorecards. It's not going to transform into a graph, but it'll give you some things that stand out. And we found, for example, that there were 5 traits that set them apart. Well, it was like ability to navigate ambiguity, for example, adaptable, because we work in a startup environment. So I think it's also based on like the specific context within which you work. Or if you look at negative outliers of like who were the new hires that were rated inconsistent or were considered like involuntary exits, they were also most aligned with a few trends when you spoke to a few more people. So it was either, like I said earlier on, we over prioritized on technical skills. And I think that can make hiring managers make assumptions about abilities or minimize concerns with like soft skill gaps. Or if you look at higher level leaders who exited quickly, we understood that, oh, they were people who struggled to either build vision and direction, and that was specific within the Zapier context. So maybe they worked at organizations where they did this really well, but it was larger organizations where certain pieces of this were already set, versus at it in our organization, you need to set that for yourself and your team, but they were incapable of doing. So things like that will only come out when you go into the qualitative. I know that doesn't answer the question of like, how do you graph that? But the only way for us to look at it was looking at that like imperfect data piece. Looks like Darren and Melinda have some really great things to say. So I want to hear what they have to say.
Yeah, I mean, from what Anita said, first, why are you analyzing the data? What are you trying to get? What aren't you getting from the quantitative? And then if the quantitative is leading you to all of this qualitative data, you can use technology to summarize and break down all of the paragraphs of text that people have entered and break it into something more quantitative. Happy to talk about that more if that's the true need here, is just, okay, yeah, we know what we need to get, but it's impossible to get because it's in text from thousands of people. Technology can solve that.
Yeah. I don't think personally, I do not think you always need to quantify qualitative data. I often think about this as sort of like 2 steps. One is look at the quantitative data to understand the trends, then go to the qualitative data to understand the narrative that explains the trends. And the two speak to one another, but don't need to fundamentally be reduced to the same thing. But if you do have a need to quantify qualitative data, which I think is sometimes appropriate, brushing off my research methods 201, you can develop a code book, right? Where you say, like, here are certain phrases that correspond to certain themes. You can then sort of like go through your qualitative data and literally code the data. Say, here's how often the themes arise. Here's the intensity with which they arise. You can do a priori coding where you create the code back before you go to the data. You can do a posteriori coding where you create the code book as you go along in response to what you see in the data. There's a good intro article I'll drop in the chat right here for how to approach that. When I got my doctorate, generative AI wasn't yet a big thing, and I had to do all of that by hand, and it was terrible. But as Melinda was alluding to, the good news is there's now just like lots of platforms that you can use and leverage AI to create the code book with you and have it actually code all the data so that you don't have to do it manually. And I think that can be really helpful for quantifying qualitative data.
That was a perfect lead in, Darren, to a question in the chat. And we have less than 10 minutes. So I'm going to focus on what's in the chat and try to get through a couple of these to wrap us up here. Very insightful conversation today. But Samin had a question about AI. So with AI streamlining parts of the hiring process like scheduling, sourcing, talent acquisition, teams are becoming leaner and taking on more strategic initiatives. Do you foresee any new responsibilities that TA professionals in the future that may go beyond the typical recruiter role today? And how do you foresee this impacting quality of hire?
Yes, the technology can automate all of the manual things, certainly AI as well. I mean, all the manual things. Sit down and figure out, what do you trust a human to do and what do you trust technology to do? And if what you trust a human to do is talk to people, build relationships, build intuition, create judgment, then you can use technology to standardize all of this and create more quality. So I do think that the future of recruiting is going to be much more about relationships and some of the things that we talked about here today. How do you work with your hiring managers to understand what they really want, mitigate bias, create a new method of assessing candidates, and ultimately increase that quality of hire?
I strongly co-sign that. My hope is that AI gives human recruiters leverage in the technical sense, of like just enables us to do more because it's taking things off of people's plates that they're not uniquely suited to do. One of the things that I think is becoming increasingly important with AI that I would just name is I'm a believer there's no such thing as objective data. All data reflects a set of assumptions that people bring to it or a set of premises. We construct a system in which data exists. And a lot of generative AI is trained on big data sets that are not necessarily representative of the population as a whole. And that leads to real big challenges. From the prototypical example of this in my mind that's like so stark, so clear, is how bad AI is in the criminal justice space, because it is trained on data sets from an inequitable society where people from certain backgrounds are more likely to end up in the criminal justice system, right? But I think it applies to all roles. Like, we as human beings really need to interrogate what are the assumptions that are often implicit and not stated explicitly that undergird the data sets that AI is trained on, and how could that be leading to things that actually aren't in line with our values, our beliefs, or our business goals. And I think that's a space that's really, really important for recruiters to get involved, and the type of thing that, like, there wasn't a need for recruiters to be good at that 1 year ago, let alone 5 years ago, but it is a thing that we need to become good at. And I think there's going to be lots more like that created by AI.
Yes. Challenge any vendor you talk to about their assumptions. Ask them, how do they humanize it? How do they mitigate process? Simple example, do they remove first and last names if AI is reviewing resumes? Because it should. I could talk a lot, but I'll let.
Thank you. Anita, I think you were gonna.
No, I just really co-sign everything that they say. Just to answer the last part of the question, around like any new responsibilities, I don't know if I see it as new, but I see it as, if someone takes on like AI being able to help with certain things, what can recruiters do even better and spend more time with, because they may or may not have had the time to focus on when they had to do every aspect of it, is things like being that strategic advisor to your hiring manager, getting them to be more focused on like, what is that alignment? What are we looking for? Debunking biases, like Melinda was saying, like how can we do those pieces? And also even more focusing on candidate experience. I think more and more and more organizations, if you look at employer brand, or you go on these websites where people talk about their experience interviewing with a company, or their experience having worked at a lot of times it's about the candidate experience. How do they leave? Whether it's can the recruiter now have time to provide feedback, whether a person has been accepted or not? They probably can. And if I were to be rejected from an interview, if someone were to tell me how I can do better, like nothing can be a better gift for me to leave that interview than that. And recruiters almost never had time for that because of just the sheer number of people that they have to work with. But maybe now they have time because they are not scheduling or they're not doing those other things that now AI can possibly take on. And then the second thing that they can do a lot more of now, I mean, I feel like recruiters probably are and should also already be working a lot with data, because I think data tells them where to go and how to look at things and just overall be better and more strategic recruiters. But maybe you can spend even more time on that data piece, because you can really dive into it and use the AI to be able to tell you some of those stories, but then take that on even further to make the most strategic decisions as a recruiter that can actually set you apart as a recruiter. I think it can set you apart as like that strategic recruiter who knows exactly where to go, what to do, and how to find the right talent that you need.
Mm-hmm. That's great. We're going to squeeze in one last question. Okay, so this is from Cassie. I'm curious to hear from the panelists on any changes they've made or recommend to make to their hiring processes based on the quality of hire data they've analyzed. Are there any specific ways of assessment that you've seen give a stronger signal to having strong quality of hire over others?
I'll give a very brief answer to this. So, I described earlier, we try and do cycles of studying our most effective hires, understanding what leads them to be effective, and then backwards mapping from that. What does our process need to look like? How should it change? What should it stay the same? And for both recruiting teachers for Teach for America, as well as for recruiting recruiters for Teach for America, like we have completely changed our model multiple times over the years as we've learned. One thing that I would just key in on, sort of a learning for me, is I find the greatest value in doing tasks with people in the interview. There's often, like when you're asking sort of like retrospective questions, tell me about a time where you did X, Y, Z. At the worst, someone can just be deceitful and make up something and lie. I actually don't experience that as happening very often. More commonly, their self-awareness is just the story they would tell is different than the story that other people would tell around them. And so you sometimes get people who overinflate their knowledge and skill because they're representing what they experienced, and it's different than what other people experience of them. And I find that doing things with people gives me a much better read of their actual knowledge and skills. So that's one concrete thing that has really shifted in how I approach hiring.
I will just say that long assessments, the take homes that take, you say, oh, it'll only take 3 hours. And then really candidates are spending 3, 4, 5 days because they have not helped indicate a top candidate. And I like Darren's approach and think it's, much more helpful.
I'm not even going to add anything there. I think those were some great bullets.
Great. Well, amazing. I feel like we could spend a whole nother hour on this. So maybe there'll be a part 2 coming at some point. We had a bunch more questions we didn't get to. Wanted to say a huge, huge thank you to all of our panelists today, Darren, Anita, and Melinda, for being here with us and imparting all of your wisdom. I think I learned a lot here today. I'm sure everyone else who attended has learned a lot as well. So again, I will be sending out an email after this with the recording and all of their LinkedIn profiles, so feel free to connect with them. Also, just a quick note, we have a lot of other great webinars and workshops and fireside chats just like this one coming up. So feel free to follow Talent Collective's LinkedIn page, and we have a Luma page as well if you want to attend any of our other events. Some topics that we have coming up are supporting working parents in the workplace. And then we have a few AI demos of different products from Findem, Modern Loop, and CoderPad coming up. Also, Talent Collective will be at RecFest next week. So if anyone on this call will be at RecFest, actually this week, did I say next week? please come by and say hello. And again, thank you to our panelists. We hope everyone has a wonderful day, and we will see you all soon.
Thank you all. This is really fun. Bye, friends.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.